It's an unfortunate fact of life that we just cannot function without electricity. I know that's a bit rich of me to say since I beam my face into your phone for a living, but it's a great shame that we are now at the point where self-sufficiency has been traded for the industrialised technocratic hellscape that we're in now, with no means or ability to escape it. However, nature has a way of fighting back sometimes. After all, you've seen what acts of God and bad weather can do to power lines and power stations, with high winds and falling trees causing a lot of damage. Considering the fact that society as we know it would completely collapse if the lights suddenly went out, the grid that powers all of it is surprisingly vulnerable. After all, it stretches for thousands and thousands of miles just sitting there. And there simply isn't enough manpower to keep an eye on all of it 24/7. So imagine the kind of hell that can break loose if a few ne'er-do-wells start to notice that. Now, attacks on critical infrastructure is something that governments will go absolutely mental over. They will throw absolutely every resource available at preventing such things and going after people who even had just a passing thought about doing something like that. And the media would have an absolute field day if such a thing was ever attempted. But that's what makes this incident really strange, since none of that happened. The government and the media were rather nonchalant about the entire thing, and we never really got any answers, which is rather suspicious. This place is haunted. But anyway, let's have a look at one of the biggest terrorist attacks that you've probably never heard of. The Metcalfe sniper attack. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, a big thank you to Fume for sponsoring this video. Lent might be over, but that's no excuse to not continue to give up bad habits. But you don't need to walk the desert for 40 days and 40 nights because there is an easier way. Switching to Fume, the all-natural, award-winning flavoured air device that has already been enjoyed guilt-free by over 150,000 customers. Free from electronics, vapour and harmful chemicals, Fume allows you to leave the miasma of modernity behind in favour of tasty flavours that will get you in touch with nature. Since I'm a pretty cool and fresh guy, I'm really enjoying crisp mint at the moment. Ah, nature. While Fume is all natural on the inside, the outside is precision built to keep you de-stressed, with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting. But if that's not fidgety enough for you, then get ready for some advanced stimming with Base. A weighted stand you can sit your Fume on with a built-in magnet that lets you spin your Fume to your heart's content. Fume is truly more based than ever. The only part of it that sucks is you. And thanks to Fume's adjustable airflow dial, you can even choose how hard you suck. And believe me, you'll be fuming that you didn't try it sooner. So if you want to get a little fruity with me while supporting my channel, then scan the QR code on the screen or go to tryfume.com/Dankula and use code Dankula to get 10% off on the Journey Pack. That's tryfum.com and use code Dankula to save 10% off on your order today. Located near San Jose in California, Metcalfe Transmission Substation is one of 45,000 of its kind in the United States, owned and operated by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, or PG&E. It is a 500 kilovolt substation that supplies thousands of homes and Silicon Valley with electricity. So you could say that it's a fairly important piece of infrastructure, an important piece of infrastructure that warrants close protection, surely. Nah, just a chain link fence and some inward pointed CCTV cameras would do, apparently. So, at 2 minutes to 1 in the morning on the 16th of April 2013, someone got into a cable vault under a heavy manhole cover near Monterey Highway, and they cut 6 fibre optic cables owned by AT&T with heavy wire cutters, which knocked out all of the phone lines in the area, including for 911 calls. 9 minutes later, a similar vault was also infiltrated and cables belonging to a local internet service provider were cut. Then, with the means to call for help disabled, the real fun began. At 01:31, the shooting started. For 19 minutes, around 120 .30 caliber rifle rounds were pumped into the Metcalfe substation by a gunman or gunmen equipped with night vision scopes. The substation's CCTV only showed one rifle firing at a time, so the attack was likely carried out by a single shooter. But that doesn't mean that he would have acted alone. Since it seems to be a trend on this channel for some fucking reason, it wasn't until 01:37, 6 minutes into the attack, that PG&E finally noticed the alarms going off, which were tripped by motion sensors as bullets grazed the fence. But it wouldn't be until 4 minutes afterwards that something actually got done about it. An operator at the nearby Metcalfe Energy Centre heard the gunshots and called the cops over in Gilroy, 20 miles away from the substation. At the same time, a driver on US Route 101 also called the cops, reporting what he described as fireworks coming from the substation. But no response would happen quickly enough to save the substation's infrastructure because at 01:45, the overheating transformers started to shut down, which raised alarms at the PG&E control centre 90 miles away. Finally, at 01:51, the cops arrived at the scene. 10 minutes after receiving the calls and just 1 minute after the shooter or shooters vanished into the night. At 03:15, a technician arrived to assess the damage to the substation, and half an hour later, PG&E finally got a hold of the sheriff's office, reporting that the chain-link security fence of the substation had been breached, transformers were damaged, and a hazardous liquid had been spilled. After the sheriff and deputies looked at the carnage, a spokesman ever so astutely pointed out that, and I quote, "The damage was caused by multiple gunshots from a high-powered rifle." I would say that the authorities phoned in their response to the attack, but they couldn't even fucking do that because someone had cut the cables. But hey, at least no one was injured. The same couldn't be said for the substation, however. 17 transformers, 6 circuit breakers, and oil tanks and other things were all damaged in the attack. The fibre optic cables were fixed the next day, but Gilroy Police Department didn't have working landline phones for 24 hours while the repairs were carried out. And mobile phone service was spotty all over the place in the aftermath of the attack. Thankfully, emergency calls were back up and running rather quickly because 911 calls were rerouted through different cables after only a couple of hours of disruption. And as for the area's electricity supply, a blackout was actually prevented by utility workers rerouting powers around the site and other plants beefing up their power production to compensate for the busted transformers. The day after the attack, AT&T put out a bounty for information that would bring the cable saboteurs to justice, offering $250,000, which was matched by PG&E when they followed suit the following Thursday. That might seem like a high reward, but the Metcalfe substation was out of commission for 27 days after this attack, and the repairs came at a cost of $15 million. So AT&T, and especially PG&E, were very keen to see the perpetrators behind bars. But who were the perpetrators? Excellent question. We have absolutely no idea. Even to this day, zero leads, zero names, nothing. We have no fucking clue who carried out this attack. But it is believed that the attack was the work of multiple people. Small piles of rocks were found, along with an abundance of rifle casings at the scene, which could possibly have been markers of vantage points left by advanced scouts. Also, the casings are what provided the authorities with their estimate of the number of rounds fired at the Transformers. But they also led to a rather mixed impression of how well trained the shooter or shooters actually were, since most of the shots missed. The attackers kinda got a little bit roasted, with one Fed named John Lightfoot saying, and I quote, "We don't think this was a sophisticated attack. It doesn't take a very high degree of training or access to technology to carry out this attack." And then Lightfoot just started to get pretty mean by adding, "A sniper can hit a target the size of a silver dollar at 300 yards. That's a sniper. This guy was standing 60 yards away from a target the size of a house, and we didn't find as many bullet holes as we found rounds, which means that at least some of the rounds completely missed the target." However, not everyone agreed with this take, as a transmission operations VP at PG&E said, and I quote, "These were not amateurs taking pot shots, because the shots were described as methodical because they were placed in such a way that the substation would be disabled, but it wouldn't explode." You see, the Transformers were deliberately hit on the radiators so that they would overheat and shut down, after the loss of about 52,000 gallons of coolant oil. Also, the fact that the attack took place in the middle of the night in springtime also reduced the stress on the infrastructure itself because it was a time of very low electricity usage. If it was during the daytime in the summer when everyone was blasting the aircon, the day might have just got even hotter when a whole transformer fucking exploded. So that was the strange thing about the precision of the shots. They were done in such a way where all of the equipment would be disabled, but it wouldn't explode. But not only did the attackers seem to have knowledge of the substation's equipment, but they also seemed to know the surrounding area because their clean getaway suggested a degree of expertise and planning, with Mark Johnson, a former PG&E vice president, saying, and I quote, "This wasn't an incident where Billy, Bob and Joe decided after a few brewskis to come in and shoot up a substation. This is an event that was well thought out, well planned, and they targeted certain components." This was further cemented by the fact that there was planned and coordinated attacks on cable vaults to delay the police response. Further confusing the narrative was the fact that the Santa Clara County Sheriff, Laurie Smith, seemed to think that it might have been a lone wolf attack, saying that the deputies didn't find any of the aforementioned rock piles despite having spent days at the scene. Also, while the manhole covers leading to the fibre optic cables were so heavy that it would have needed at least 2 people to lift it, they could have been lifted by a single well-equipped person with the right tools and know-how. And, like I said earlier, only one muzzle flash was seen at a time on the CCTV. So, while there was probably a team behind different aspects of the whole operation, there was probably only one shooter. A month after the attack, a man dressed in black was spotted right next to the site at about 3 o'clock in the morning, which triggered a search that unfortunately went nowhere. And to this day, there have still been no arrests. There aren't even any suspects. Even despite the feds getting on the case and local investigators releasing the CCTV footage of the attack in late June in the hope that the public might know something. But no tips were received. So there are no leads, no prints, no shadows, no faces. The only thing that the CCTV caught was the muzzle flashes and some sparks against the fence because the shooter or shooters kept a distance of 40 to 60 yards away from the substation, far enough back that the cameras couldn't focus on them. No one ever even owned up to the attack, which is surprising because ISIS was a big concern at the time, and they try and take credit for fucking everything. But while the case went cold, the blood of the higher-ups in the energy sector was boiling, because this attack on the substation was the first of its kind, which scared the shit out of the entire industry because they thought, oh shit, is this going to be a regular thing now? Overnight, everyone suddenly realised just how vulnerable energy infrastructure actually is. Many substations like Metcalfe were protected by nothing more than some cameras and a chain link fence. So, if it could happen here, it could happen everywhere. And if that's the level of security that they're dealing with, never mind crack teams of snipers across the road or nerds in goon caves hacking the mainframe, if one caravan appears on the horizon, it's all over. Just as a little aside, I actually had a friend who was a substation engineer, and she was actually called out on an emergency call at 3 o'clock in the morning because a substation had shut down, and she was the first engineer on the scene. And she was greeted by 3 gypsies who were dead because they had melted into the fucking cables. I mean, that's... I don't know why I'm laughing, because that is not funny, and she needed years of therapy. But anyway, no motive was ever established, and this whole situation is starting to glow a bit. So, it's tinfoil hat time. There are theories abound, so place your bets. Was it eco-terrorism, boogaloo terrorism, regular terrorism, a stress test of the electrical grid, a practice run for something bigger, an inside job by disgruntled employees, someone trying to get at Silicon Valley by cutting their power supply? Could it be connected to the Boston Marathon bombing, which had strangely enough occurred only 13 hours prior? Who the fuck knows? But I can't imagine it being some kind of white hat vandal saying, hey, here's 8 figures of damage and a list of infrastructural and security weaknesses. Just shore up everything wherever you see bullet holes. You're welcome. You know, there's a huge difference between infiltrating someone's system or network and leaving a friendly .text file to help them with their cybersecurity and causing $15 million of real, actual physical damage. The strangest thing about this entire situation is that no one actually knows why this was done or who did it. Though an official in the Department of Homeland Security said that there was some indication that it was the work of an insider, or someone who at least had access to insider knowledge. Of course, everyone had their theories about what happened. Plenty of accelerationists cited the Metcalfe attack as a pretty interesting development as they looked down at their own playbooks and said, interesting. After all, if enough people or groups got the same idea at the same time, the entire electric grid would be completely fucked. Don't do that though. That's a crime. And crime is bad. But Boogaloo Boys and eco-terrorists don't think that crime is bad. So they took an interest in the attack, with a consultant at a security firm called DT Analytics by the name of Darryl Johnson saying that, and I quote, "We've seen chatter on both sides of these movements that indicate they are interested in targeting infrastructure. And we've actually had cases where people in both the militia anti-government movements as well as the anarchist environmental extremist movements have been arrested for targeting critical infrastructure or actually sabotaging the electric grid." Interestingly, despite all of this speculation, the attack apparently didn't meet the Fed's definition of terrorism. As Lightfoot put it, and I quote, "At this point in the investigation, we are not aware of any political or any social agenda that has been advocated or that this act was carried out to further." So basically, while there is plenty of potential for it to be terrorism, all of the theories were just investigators spitballing. Instead, the attack was described as vandalism, which was accepted by those in the industry. Well then, Jesus Christ, that is one of the most advanced vandalism operations ever in history by some guys who seem very, very highly trained in vandalism. But anyway, for example, the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had initially described it as the most serious domestic terror attack on the grid. But he eventually backpedaled on this take by saying, and I quote, "I don't think there's any need to have any particular label on it." I've got a feeling that his opinion changed to that after he was visited by some men in suits. I mean, motive is pretty important, so you might want to find a fucking label. But of course, no one seemed to get any kind of insight out of this because while it was certainly established as a possibility, terrorism just wasn't a concern that was factored into any of the security upgrades made to the site. Truck bombs and other extreme attacks just weren't deemed as threats to the grid. Don't you just fucking love governments and corporate monopolies? They sure know how to produce results. Regardless of why this happened, the consequences of large-scale attacks on energy infrastructure are potentially devastating on an existential level for technological society. As John Wellinghoff, the former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, put it, a coordinated attack could put this country in a world of hurt for a long time. With hard times coming and different factions getting spicy, the Metcalfe sniper attack got electric companies and the government seriously thinking about how to prevent other threats to the grid in the future, including EMPs and cyber attacks. In fact, the boffins got really quite fixated on cyber attacks, despite the fact that Metcalfe was busted the old-fashioned way. After much investigation and review, congressional committees declared that the grid isn't adequately protected. Yeah, no shit. So, feds, national security officials, regulatory commissions and electric companies got on the case to shore up defences. Man, I feel safer already just hearing that, don't you? But anyway, to beef up security at a number of sites, security cameras were upgraded with infrared, audio sensors and seismic recorders. And they had their angles adjusted to improve coverage. Lights were also added and other proposed measures included replacing chain link fences with a new concrete wall to shield equipment and remove visibility for snipers, as well as clearing surrounding vegetation so that would-be saboteurs have fewer places to hide. Also, adding armour plating to sensitive electronics and keeping spare transformers and other doohickeys right there on site so that they can be quickly swapped out whenever anything gets damaged in the future. More security guards and better coordination with local law enforcement were also on the agenda to provide increased patrols. All of this was tied up with a $100 million price tag, which was invested over 3 years to improve security infrastructure across the network. According to PG&E spokesman Brian Swanson, this was a pretty huge endeavour because, and I quote, "It's not just PG&E acting alone. The utility industry as a whole is working with stakeholders like the Edison Electric Institute, with policymakers, with government and local law enforcement officials at all levels." So, how did it go? Is the grid safe now? No, it's fucking not, because a Spec Ops veteran who remained anonymous because Spec Ops veteran did a security assessment of a number of PG&E substations, including Metcalfe, and he determined that they only had bare minimum security. A year and a half after the sniper attack, other investigators made 14 visits to 9 substations and found that many of the security problems that allowed the attack to take place were still present. The substation's vulnerability had barely improved at all. To add insult to injury, 16 months after the sniper attack, the Metcalfe substation was infiltrated again on the 27th of August 2014. This time, burglars cut through the fence in 3 places and stole construction equipment at about 2 o'clock in the morning. The alarms did go off, but no one was caught, despite the thieves running amok on the site for over an hour. And the fact that they actually got away with it was attributed to human error because no one checked the fucking alarms. Apparently the King's Guard has got a side gig. The strangest thing about this attack, like we said earlier, is it definitely was not carried out by some rednecks who decided to have some drunken midnight jollies. Rednecks would not have been able to figure out the locations of cable vaults, then breach those vaults and know what specific cables to cut to delay a police response. They also would not know which precise parts of the substation to hit. And they definitely would not have been able to cover their tracks as well as this after the fact, which has led a lot of people to believe that this attack was carried out by highly trained and knowledgeable professionals. Which you would think would send the American government into absolute overdrive to figure out who the fuck did this. Especially since all of those things I just mentioned suggest either a hostile foreign state actor or a highly trained terrorist group. I realise that all of the three-letter agencies don't really give a fuck about actual crime nowadays, and they're far too busy investigating rural Americans for saying fuck Joe Biden on Facebook, but crimes against the government and government infrastructure, especially by suspected foreign actors or terrorist groups, is something that the three-letter agencies will still go completely nuclear over. Yet, they didn't. And like many other things that the government seemed to really not care about or not know anything about, it made people suspicious. Especially since government surveillance is far, far more sophisticated than they or even TV shows would have you believe. You're not just being spied on with your smartphone, they have technology straight out of sci-fi that can track down practically any kind of information that they want. Meaning that when they tell you they don't know something, they're probably lying. My own theory, which I'm just pulling out of my arse and it probably isn't true at all, is maybe this was a rogue CIA operation or something like that to scare electrical companies into beefing up their security because the state is probably expecting that specific infrastructure to suffer attacks in the future. But they don't have the funding or the government grants for it, or maybe the people in charge of those specific things just didn't see it as a big enough problem. So this attack was staged to scare the right people into putting their names on the right budget paperwork to make it happen. Maybe, I don't know, that's probably a giant pile of shit I just said, but to be fair, the electric grid does have a lot of problems with security. Of course, a lot of these problems are down to the bureaucracies in charge of making sure that things like the Metcalf sniper attack don't happen are complete fucking idiots. And with a massive skills collapse on the horizon as the few actually competent specialists retire without successors in place, these problems are only going to get worse. But even with all of the competence and willpower in the world, it is an inexorable fact that the energy grid is just too big and budgets can only stretch so far. Sure, the most vulnerable substations were earmarked for upgrades, but most probably got no extra attention at all. With so much crucial infrastructure and frankly civilization as a whole crumbling all around us, I don't think it's a stretch to say that our energy supplies are sitting on a knife edge, and there will be hell to pay when it collapses. But luckily, I see two ways out of this. Maybe not a light at the end of the tunnel because what the fuck's going to power it, but there are measures that can help take the edge off. Either buy a generator and a stockpile of fuel. You can actually get a diesel generator from Amazon for about £300, but important note, diesel only keeps for about a year, but you can buy additives to increase its shelf life, or you could take a long position on candles to make bank off of those that don't do that. Or you can get really into cocaine, develop a dommy-mommy fetish, and enjoy the Butlerian jihad. May thy substation chip and shatter.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody just subscribe.